Hello and welcome to Grocer Pod. My name's Sean Kosednar. This week I'm talking with Steve Cox, creative director at Daymon, the agency that assists the AWG Brands team in marketing AWG's private brands program. Steve is instrumental in developing AWG Brands packaging designs and creating connections between brands and consumers. But before we get to him, please remember to subscribe to Grocer Pod. Subscribing means new episodes will be downloaded for you automatically each week. You can find Grocer Pod on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen. Thanks for joining me today, Steve.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So the AWG Brands has gone through several packaging redesigns to keep them relevant for consumers. How does Daymon design help AWG's private brands stay relevant?
So for us, being connected in part of the broader Daymon network just provides us with a ton of information that we get to pull in and really kind of use at our disposal to monitor things like trends, really to help them create a really unique and ownable design architecture for AWG, right? So that's kind of our biggest, proprietary really kind of benefit that we can offer is just the extensive network that we have that we can dig into. But beyond that, we're also doing things on a smaller scale for individual brand owners. So like for AWG, where we have multiple brands, really looking at the total brand portfolio. How can we make each brand have its own space of what they're offering a consumer? And then, beyond that, looking at design trends. So as we're starting to see the evolution of different tiers and different platforms for brands, whether it be photography, typography, color, how those are coming to fruition in the market, how people are responding to those things, and just generally how we can kind of connect those brands to what consumers want and what they need. That's kind of for us the most relevant things that we can do to make brands kind of an everyday purchase decision.
Yeah, and each of the AWG brands has brand standards and a brand positioning. What goes into developing and executing these brands?
So probably the number one thing that goes into developing those is really brand alignment. So working with, a brand owner on what's the promise they want to make to the consumer. I think when brands kind of do this in a very authentic way, it translates into the design and into the relationship that these consumers have with the brand. I think once you get past a promise you're making to a consumer through a platform or a brand delivery, you're aligning on that really takes a lot of the I like it or I don't like it decision making out of the development of the brand. And you're really focused on what are we promising the consumer? How do we back that up? How do we visualize those decisions? And really kind of have that transparent authentic conversation with the consumer through packaging. Beyond that, I think the second most important thing is really just establishing equities. So, for every brand, I think it's just as important to establish the things that are consistent to the things that can flex and move. All these different categories, especially private brands where they cover so many different categories and touch points for consumers. It's unlikely that if you're super rigid in your branding approach that you're going to connect across the board in every category. So having ways that it can, kind of dip and dive and kind of connect in different ways is super important. I think establishing those equities, both flexible and rigid, really do kind of ladder up to a brand presence on shelf that at the end of the day, consumers are going to be able to connect and trust that brand in different categories and places.
What's it like designing for someone that has multiple different brands? Because obviously, they're all working together, but they are their own separate entity.
Yep. And I think, again, that kind of ladders back to the brand alignment. If it's really clear what a brand is going to promise a consumer, whether that's a premium product or a different assortment than they're going to find with national brand products, or a better for you proposition, or just your everyday pantry items, right? Like having those clearly defined guardrails around what the brand is supposed to do within the broader portfolio makes it really easy to say, this is the space that's sacred to that brand, right? Both from a visual perspective as well as a product assortment perspective.
Then I want to touch on something because I found it really interesting that I hadn't really considered, just the breadth of some of these brands, like Best Choice, for instance. It's everything. We were just working on, charcoal and fire starters the other day, and then there's diapers, and then there's, canned green beans and, frozen potatoes. That's a lot of things that I would imagine in most design world would be covered by a bunch of different brands and not by one.
Yep, you're exactly right. It's the private brand landscape is interesting from a design perspective. It's having the 2 or 3 core elements that really define what that visual brand impression is on shelf is really what connects them all together. I think, again, when you start to go really rigid with some of the brand executions and don't give that brand a little bit of ability to flex within some of those categories, especially when you get into things that are as specific as charcoal briquettes and fire starters, and then your everyday pantry items, which are clearly very different purchase decisions, the brand needs a way to kind of evolve a little bit in these categories just to stay relevant and make sure that it's, still the same level of quality, the same level of trust that you're promising everywhere. But obviously the needs of that consumer is going to be very different in those two sections of the store.
Historically, private brand design approach tends to be more conservative in comparison to the national brands. What do you consider when designing for private brands, and how do you balance the creativity within a more conservative industry?
So the conservative part of what private brands have done from a historic perspective, I think is pretty accurate. I think it's always been up to about 10 years ago or 7 or 8 years ago, where it really started to make a shift in how brands are perceived from a private brand perspective. We've done a lot of studies at Daymon. We've kind of gathered a lot of consumer insights around this. And it's really, consumers are now giving private brand the permission to be different, right? They're no longer requiring the ability to take what a national brand is doing and saying, we're just as good. We've kind of already gotten over that hump for a little bit. Now brands have permission to kind of do what they want to bring something unique to the table. We have some statistics around shopping behaviors, and kind of 81 or so % say they buy private brands on almost every one of their shopping trips. So when you start to have consumers who are already willing to adopt the private brand platform, and they're just looking for something that will connect to them in what they want to bring to their family or bring into their home. Even so much as 75% of consumers really start to say that they choose a store based on the private brands that they offer. So, again, if consumers are in that mindset where they're already going to the store because they are already accepting the private brand, and that private brand is one that they like. And a lot of consumers now have access to multiple different retailers, all offering their own private brands. So that really just does become a pretty big driver in kind of what store they're going to go visit.
Yeah, it seems like the days of the design kind of mimicking or following the national brand equivalent are done. And at least when it comes to, the Best Choice and AWG, line of products, they're trying to, venture out on their own and look significantly different. To that end, Clearly by Best Choice has been awarded several Graphic Design USA awards for the new look for the entire line. Why do you think it won these awards?
So awards are an interesting kind of component to what we do. I look at them as somewhat of a byproduct. I don't think any retailer or brand owner really goes into developing a private brand with the sole objective of kind of winning an award for the design. Obviously the product quality is something that really kind of drives repeat purchase. So, we really focus a lot on the retailer's goals. So like our job as an agency is to really take those goals and really align with the visual creation of the brand and say, how can we portray this on shelf in a way that we're kind of authentic and transparent? And I think you start to get some retailers that are really adventurous, and that's their personality. So you start to think about brands like Trader Joe's and what they're doing, right? They have a personality on shelf that is uniquely theirs, which is authentic to who they are as a company. So something like Clearly by Best Choice, and really the promise that we've made with Clearly by Best Choice to the consumer was done through the communication hierarchy. So bringing that free from and better for you communication to the forefront was something that was kind of the authentic promise from AWG in terms of the products that are going to fall under that brand. And I think when you start to connect the visual language of a brand to the promise it makes, done in a very truly authentic way, it'll start to gain some traction and recognition. Obviously, awards are a really nice validation point. So we want to create something that people are proud to buy. They want to put in their cart. They want to tell other people about it. And for us, that's really kind of what the awards do for us, is really validate that we've done our job well. Being recognized within the design community is great. But a lot of them are really driven by consumer insights as well.
What did the discussion sound like? Because you mentioned, Trader Joe's, and I can see how that works really easily for all of the stores that have, this is our store, this is our brand, this is what you're going to carry. But AWG is obviously all independent stores. Yep. So you might design something that fits really well in one sort of model, but it's got to go in all of the different independent stores. So what do those discussions sound like when you're coming up with the designs, and how is it going to play across all the different concepts and banners that AWG has?
Yeah, no, interesting question. Every brand is kind of its own unique animal. It's got to compete in its own landscape, and so for us, we do a lot of work around looking at the regional market and kind of what brands are in those spaces. So Trader Joe's has its own regional market. It carved out a white space for itself, but to your point, it also connects to a banner, right, to the name on the store. But interestingly enough, we're seeing a lot of brands out there that are doing the opposite of that. So building a brand set of visual assets, the trust that they are putting into a somewhat of a banner agnostic brand, and building that up is definitely a trend that we're seeing a couple other pop up in a couple other places. So, you have newer brands that are being developed, similar to Best Choice. You have brands like Good and Gather, and you have brands like Know and Love, right? So these are brands that are not necessarily connected to a specific retailer per se. So really the marketing efforts around building the consumer message for that brand, getting it out to the consumers in that regional market, really explaining the benefits and types of products that they're going to offer underneath these different brands, I think really does kind of play up to what we talked about earlier in terms of consumers are now trusting a private brand. It can be a little bit more of its own animal and kind of, live in its own space. So with that comes a lot of freedom from brand naming and design as well.
One of the ways to build that trust is to have a consistent packaging, and Best Choice Center Store packaging is moving to one consistent look. What was behind that decision, and how do you keep the brand consistent while giving different categories or departments distinct looks?
Yeah. So brand recognition, I think, is probably one of the biggest strengths of a core private brand's kind of reach, right? If you can establish a trust or a level of trust with a consumer in one category, the brand recognition and that consistency across categories really does a couple things. It makes it easy for them to find and shop. We know how busy consumers are. We know how much they have allocated to their day in terms of shopping. It's in some cases, it's not something they really have time to do. It's something they have to do. So how can we make that journey through the supermarket just easier for them? Pick out the brand they like at a very quick glance, identify the flavors and things that they want to put in their cart. So brand recognition becomes a hugely big tool for private brand in terms of establishing some connection across categories. Consistency is one way to do that. But again, consistency is great as long as it doesn't become too rigid. So the core equities of something like Best Choice, the brand architecture that's consistent, the types of backgrounds that we use are in a consistent manner. So those really start to set the stage for a consumer as they're viewing any different category. But when we start getting into choices of colors and typographic treatments and fonts and different layouts for the pack, just based on the proportions and kind of unique, space that's available on some of these packaging configurations, that's where the flexibility really comes in. So I think even when you have the one or two things that stay consistent, it's very easy for the consumer to go, yep, that's still the same brand. It's still the brand I trust. Make my shopping decision even easier.
And I know we've touched on this a little bit, but we're coming up to the end of the year and just looking forward, what trends are you seeing in the private brands industry when it comes to packaging design?
Yeah. So, we've talked about a couple things that I think fold into some bigger trends that we're seeing. So, sustainability is going to be a big one coming up as well. I think consumers are very aware of things being recyclable, compostable. We're starting to see a lot of packaging that's removing any unnecessary plastic. So you'll see a lot of pasta boxes that the window is going away because that little bit of plastic across millions of impressions, adds up to a fairly big difference for those brands to really kind of make an effort to be more sustainable. I don't see that trend kind of stopping, especially when we start to see some stats around, like 6 out of 10 shoppers really interested in brands that have a eco-friendly packaging of some kind. So any effort that brands can make to kind of support this effort is really going to connect to, what matters to consumers, right? And I think that's part of just that brand trust that people establish or with a brand, right? It folds into my lifestyle. We hear a lot of consumers in data talk about how private brands fit into their lifestyle, even potentially more than a national brand. And I think that's just due to the scale. They're making that promise and then they're doing it broadly across multiple categories. So they're really kind of amplifying that touch point. So that's one of them. Brand independence is something that I think is going to continue to grow. So again, I think we touched on it a little bit, where brands just don't necessarily need to connect to to a name on a storefront. Really kind of building their own independent look and feel from a naming perspective all the way through to a visual equity. Again, the consumers are willing to adopt these private brands, whether it says the name of the store or not. If the message is clear, concise, and the products deliver on that message. So I do think that there's going to be a bigger push around brand independence in the future as well. And then the last one that I think is actually pretty interesting as a trend is private brands are really starting to be much more unique. So from a product offering assortment, we do know that like 80+% of consumers are really looking for brands that offer them something different from a flavor perspective, right? So I think private brands are starting to see some innovation in flavors and push their flavor assortments into some different directions that are enticing for consumers, delivering on that sense of curiosity that they have for trying different foods. So that's something that I think will kind of extend into some other categories. Some categories are early adopters of that. I know things like, potato chips have always had those really kind of unique seasonal flavors. You get around Christmas time and you get like the turkey dinner flavor, things like that. So, again, I think from a seasonality perspective, we see a lot of pumpkin spice stuff coming in to different categories each year around this time. But again, I think it just gives that sense of discovery for a consumer, right? How do I get to try something a little bit outside of the norm with a brand that I'm already willing to trust?
Yeah, I think that's all super interesting. And I think, tell me if I'm wrong here, but it seems like in the past, the main thing about private labels was that they competed on price. And now it seems like that's not necessarily the driver. Obviously, like there are those brands that's the key thing, but it doesn't have to be for all of them. And everything that you're saying here, like whether it's sustainability, differentiation, independence, like all of those things, like none of that's cheap. And so to do these things well, like it's not going to be like, oh, this is, you buy private label because you're trying to save money from buying the national label. You're buying private label because the product's really good. And maybe you do get to save some money as well.
Yeah. And I think that's where some of the tiering comes in, right? So we'll have within the AWG portfolio, just looking at Best Choice, which is kind of your everyday, right? It's got the most breadth of products to shop for pretty much everything you're going to do to cook and kind of supply your house. But then there's also Best Choice Superior Selections, right? So just that interesting kind of flavor profile that might not be a everyday item, but something really unique that you go, yeah, I really want to try that, or something that's sourced to be, just kind of a different meal solution than you would get from your everyday, kind of products that you put in your pantry to have as staples. So, I think a lot of it just goes into developing a portfolio of brands that can offer a consumer the full end-to-end, shopping experience, right? Get everything I need for my family, make sure I have the foods that everyone likes on a regular basis, all the way up to, this is super interesting. Let's see if we can, create a little bit of surprise and delight one night for dinner or a meal for, a gathering or something like that. So I think all of those things are really important for, private brands to consider, right? So again, you just become that top of mind solution for any consumer as they're walking down the aisle.
So the majority of the Grocer Pod listeners are independent retailers. What can they do, in your opinion, as the creative director? What can they do to help make AWG's private labels even more successful?
Yeah, so I think input. I think a lot of these retailers will know their shopper and what's important to their shopper. Because I think the brands that AWG and we've helped AWG create are very flexible in terms of the different things that you can overlay onto them, right? They're the core foundations of those looks and feels. But I know, there's some markets that probably serve different communities that have different taste and flavor profiles that are really important to them. And again, I think the input from those, independent retailers is super important. Just, because the brand can support it. It just needs to know what's the market, right? Who wants to buy it? Who's looking to buy it? Who you're looking to attract as a customer? And I think that's really the important parts from anybody who's going to have, input from a brand perspective as they're putting it on a retail shelf.
I think we're going to leave it there. Thanks for joining me today, Steve.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
And thank you all for listening to this episode of Grocer Pod. That's it for this week. My name is Sean Kosednar, and I'll be back next week with another episode of Grocer Pod.